Gunfire's not a good idea right now.
Don't shoot!
It's okay, ladies. I'll get you out of here and back to your families. Whoa, hey, I'm trying to save you.
Dead to Rights is the best bad Max Payne clone of all time.
Things are gonna get rough.
Developed by Namco and released for the Xbox in 2002, and then the PC, PlayStation 2, and GameCube later down the track, it's a story about a man named Jack Slate and his dog, going on a crusade to kill thousands of people as he finds the reasons behind the death of a single person. Set amongst the backdrop of Grant City, the hardest place on Earth.
Grant City. Hardest place on Earth.
It also got followed up with 2 other games, Dead to Rights 2, Dead to Rights Reckoning, and Dead to Rights Retribution. And I had actually planned to talk about all of these games here, which is something I still might do in the future, but after I got knee deep into the first one, I started to realise that there's more than enough material here just to keep me busy in this first game alone.
Whoa, Officer Slade, what brings you out on a night like tonight?
Dead to Rights is really just one of those games that's a relic of its time, something you can play which instantly takes you back to that era.
Hey, I'm trying to save you.
When you play something like this, you know you're playing something from the early 2000s, and if you've got no real context or basis for playing games like this, well, then it's probably going to seem antiquated and frustrating. But it is one of those perfect examples of a bygone era, and it features the kind of writing and content that you just don't see anymore. There's a term you might have heard used before too called ludonarrative dissonance, which basically means that a character acts one way in a narrative sense, which also then kind of conflicts with the way that they act during gameplay. And Dead to Rights, I think, is a perfect example of that. Because here you've got Jack Slate, just your run-of-the-mill K9 officer and a supposed good guy, killing hundreds if not thousands of people along the way, and in a lot of instances killing them in a pretty brutal fashion. But hey, I guess it's all in the name of justice, right? In comparison, I think that's why a movie like Die Hard works so well, which is something I think Dead Rights takes a lot of influence from. In the first Die Hard movie, John McClane kills like 10 people in total. One of those you could argue was unintentional, 2 of them are almost an accident, and technically it was the fall that killed Hans Gruber, not McClane. At one point too, he didn't even want to shoot these guys, he just tried to get them to drop their weapons instead. Either way though, it was a realistic kill tally, and it made the threat seem genuine but also believable, as something that a regular person with John's training could possibly overcome. Now coming back to Jack Slate, on the other hand, the dude rocks up a kill count here that makes even Rambo look like an amateur.
Rambo is a pussy.
And he does it with so little restraint that you almost kind of forget that you're supposed to be playing as the hero. Now, before I get too far into things, I do want to mention too that this video is sponsored by Steelseries. These guys make really good keyboards, gaming mice, gaming pads, and headsets. Right now I'm using the Apex 7 keyboard, I've got the Rival 5 mouse, not to mention their huge-ass LED prism cloth. And I'm pretty stoked to be able to offer a discount on all of these products, along with everything else in their catalogue. To get that discount's really easy, just use the promo code GMAN at checkout and you'll get 12% off your next order, which is, 12% more than you'd save otherwise. So head on over to steelseries.com to get started and yeah, enjoy the rest of the video. Apparently this whole game was originally supposed to be based off the film Escape from New York. There's even a video on YouTube which shows off a bunch of gameplay, which is pretty much just unchanged from the finished product, only instead of Snake Plissken, it's got Jack instead. And I could see how this would have worked in that regard. Gunning down people without a second thought and then executing them would feel a lot more natural when you're playing as Plissken. Doesn't help either that this truly has some of the worst dialogue and voice acting I think of all time.
Something smelled fishy, and it wasn't the sushi bar.
Hearing the voice actor for Jack read through all of this narration kinda reminds me of hearing Harrison Ford giving that phoned-in performance in that original cut for Blade Runner.
Don't do anything stupid, Slate.
Justice may not be smart, but it should be honest. I was about to do something real stupid.
At least Harrison was doing it for a paycheck though. I mean, I can't imagine there's big bucks in doing voiceover work back in 2002 for an Xbox game.
Pilot, swing around to the parking lot! Now!
You got it, pal. Take it easy.
The way that some of these lines are read out too is just hilarious. Like, listen to how Jack talks about his dad being dead, literally minutes after he finds out.
You won't tell him, will you? It'd probably kill him.
Yeah, don't worry about it. He's already dead.
What?
Come again.
He's already dead.
There's a character you have to fight later in the game called Diggs, who's like a retired heavyweight boxer or something, and I honestly couldn't tell if this guy's supposed to be South African, Australian, or a goddamn Pommy.
Take it back, or I'll tear your bloody crust off.
And don't worry, we'll get to that guy doing the Christopher Walken impersonation soon enough. Really though, the whole thing's about family, and that's what's so powerful about it.
Should put you down like your ex-partner.
And I think overall anyway, you're not really supposed to be taking the story all that seriously.
Clowns with guns? I'll be having nightmares about this for months.
Racking up that kill count's where most of your time's going to be spent here. Off the back of that too, Dead to Rights actually does have some pretty decent shooting controls, I mean, all things considered. It's also, I think, a pretty good example of one of those games coming from that time period of Max Payne clones. Now, I know that these kind of games also draw influence from things like John Woo films, but you can't deny the fact that after Max Payne came out, we just got this slew of bullet time shooters that really seem to prioritize stylistic gunplay as a key feature. There was even a really good port for Max Payne out on the Xbox around the same time, so people were definitely in the mood for jumping slowly sideways and shooting at things, in which regards I think Dead to Rights is no different. Outside of the whole bullet time mechanic, I mean, even the basic story setup is kind of similar. In Max Payne, he goes up against the Mafia before uncovering a greater conspiracy involving all of these powerful government figures. In Dead to Rights, it's all these various gang members before uncovering a plot involving the city mayor. They both have the same main character narrating frequently, though Max Payne definitely does a better job at it.
Vinny Gognitti was running scared. He could run, but with a bullet in his stomach like a broken bottle of Tabasco, he was quickly running out of time.
They escorted me to a room and told me to sit tight, but I didn't have time for that.
Plus, there's a femme fatale in both of these that works with the main character.
How do you like your whiskey?
Max Payne, it's Mona Saxon. In Dead to Rights, it's an ambiguously Asian-sounding woman named Eve, and at one point they both get killed off. Sorry, spoilers.
No!
You want to get nuts? Let's get nuts. Both games also have a jackhammer shotgun, and both characters wear stylish leather jackets. But that's where I think the similarities end, because outside of the bullet time, the shooting feels worlds apart to Max Payne's. Although there is a manual aim mechanic, most of the shooting is going to be done here by holding down the left trigger to lock onto enemies and then firing with the A button. It might seem like a bit of a cop-out or that it's going to make the game too easy or something, but you'll be choking on those words later in the campaign, right around the same time you're choking on the game's dick as it proceeds to violate you with its difficulty spikes. You can cycle between targets with the right thumbstick, and more importantly, if you hold down the Y button, you can do a slow motion jump in any direction, shooting at enemies at the same time. It's hands down one of the most useful mechanics in the entire game, and I think definitely one that makes the combat a lot of fun. If you're ever out of ammo, which is something that's going to happen a lot, because some genius thought it was a good idea here to give you only one magazine for most of your weapons. Well, if that happens, you can run right up to enemies and disarm them, a lot of which come with some pretty awesome animations. There's also a human shield mechanic where you can grab onto an NPC and use them to block incoming bullets. And this becomes pretty much an essential feature later in the game just because of the sheer amount of bad guys you've got to deal with. Almost to the point I think that it starts to shift the style of the gameplay as slow-mo jumping around rooms starts to become a bit less effective. With the weapons, you've got pistols and submachine guns, both of which are pretty much useless from long range, along with rifles, launchers, and probably best of all, the shotguns. Now, there's 3 shotguns in Dead to Rights, and they all tear absolute ass. You've got a sawn-off, a Spaz 12, and then an automatic shotgun similar to that jackhammer from Max Payne. And if they sure nailed one thing in this game, it's the way these guns feel. You get like a literal screen jolt each time you fire one of these, plus they do the right amount of damage too, shredding through enemies at close range like they fucking should. It's also kind of broken in the way you can do one of those slow motion leaps and easily wipe out like 3 or 4 dudes before you've even touched the ground. Early on in the game, you can also get around by tossing explosive canisters at enemies, then blowing them up with a followed up shot. But I kind of found that this became less useful the further you get into the game, only because you get killed so quickly that like standing out in the open trying to lock onto one of these things, it's kind of like signing your own death warrant. But it does make for some pretty explosions for these earlier chapters. Finally, there is a cover mechanic where you can attach yourself to walls and peek out to take shots at enemies, though this ain't really all that useful, mostly because enemies are often pretty mobile and they don't really stand still waiting for you to peek out and shoot them. But it is definitely, I think, ahead of the curve here, and it might even be one of the first Xbox games to have this feature.
I guess I can live with that.
The other new mechanic is Shadow the Dog, not to be confused with Shadow the Hedgehog. Yikes. And Shadow's a pretty obvious homage to Shadow Dancer, an old arcade and Mega Drive game, which I've owned by the way, where you played as a ninja with his own attack dog. He doesn't really do all that much during the general gameplay though, outside of pretty much just being a free kill button. Because whenever the meter is charged up, you can send Shadow out to attack a single enemy, killing them instantly and bringing their weapon back to Jack like a good little boy.
All bombs in place, sir.
There's one chapter where you need to use Shadow to sniff out a bunch of bombs, something that happens not once, not twice, not thrice, but 4 times.
Good boy.
After that though, I don't think you control him directly for the rest of the game. He just kind of appears during cinematics and when you want to use him for that easy kill.
You wouldn't be pulling one over us.
Yeah, and what a sight that is too, man. Watching this cute little dog jump up onto someone and rip their goddamn throat out. I mean, damn.
Good boy.
Now, Dead to Rights definitely shines early on here when it's just about moving through these rain-soaked streets and gunning down dudes like you're in a John Woo film. But sadly, that doesn't last for the entire campaign, and I suppose we should probably talk about that because this campaign is one hell of a journey.
You're gonna be smoking out the ears while we drink fruity blender drinks on the beach.
Maybe I'll tag along. Run behind you guys, kicking your ass the whole way.
I honestly expected this to be like a 5 or 6 hour long game where I just steamroll through a bunch of brain dead bad guys and call it a day. And honestly, if that was the case, well, I would have been fine with that. What I got instead was a fever dream that lasted almost twice that time. I actually did a bit of research on the internet over this thing, and I found out that apparently the Xbox version was the hardest out of all these 4 platforms. At first, this was a timed release for the Xbox, with the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube version released shortly afterwards. And those 2 versions were supposedly made much easier. So I guess that makes the Xbox version ultra violent, whereas the PlayStation 2 and the GameCube are more hurt me plenty. Either way though, I wish I knew that when I first started playing this, but I still don't think that would have changed just how far out there some of the aspects of this game can be.
No!
So the whole thing starts with a pretty standard tutorial level, which gives you a good rundown of how everything works before you're then given free reign for a bit to kill a bunch of enemies, just to, you know, make sure you've got the controls down pat. After then finding out about his dad's death, which is really the be-all and end-all for the entire plot, Jack then heads to a nearby strip club to speak to an old colleague of his named Hildy, who went from working as a private investigator to this.
What are you doing here?
Because I guess that's the only real career options for women who live in the hardest place on Earth.
Grant City. Hardest place on Earth.
Anyway, after that, you then begin the first proper level of the game. Not playing as Jack, but playing as Hildy the stripper in a minigame where you need to pole dance to distract the bouncers so Jack can sneak past and get into a nightclub. Okay. And this was the point right here where I understood immediately why so many people liked this game back in the day. People who are now adults but who would have been conveniently around the right age, that a semi-naked lady dancing on a stripper's pole would have seemed like the best thing they'd seen since sliced bread. Don't you reckon too that it's always these kinds of levels in these otherwise innocuous games, when your mum or dad would just happen to walk into the room in the middle of it?
What are you doing here?
Anyway, after that, once Jack gets inside the nightclub, his whole subterfuge act means nothing anyway, because the first thing he does is turn on a goddamn fire alarm. Clearing the place out, but also alerting every security guard within a 5-mile radius to his presence, all of whom he has to either punch or shoot in the face. After this, you're then back on the streets trying to find someone named Augie Blitz. Augie Blitz, that's a real name apparently, and shake this guy down for information. Augie's voiced by someone doing the worst or best, I can't decide, Christopher Walken impression I've ever heard.
You want to join us? $100 ante? Or is that too rich for your cop salary?
Kinda have to wonder how this guy got away with this. Like, were they just in the recording booth one day and the voice actor was like, you know what, I think I'm gonna read my lines like Christopher Walken.
Help! Someone get this nut job cop off my tail!
I don't know, I guess the guy's just a poor schmo who got lucky. And sue me if I want to give some back.
Whoa, hey, your old man's dead.
If that ain't weird enough for you, well, shortly after this, you meet another wacky out-of-this-world character, a guy named Patch. A guy who looks Japanese, has purple hair and eye patch, and speaks with a British accent for some reason.
You probably don't realise how much skill it took not to paint the floor with your brain meat.
One point later in the game too, Jack describes him as being the person with a gold Luger, and it's like, dude, out of all the characteristics this guy has, you're going with his choice of weaponry?
Gold Luger. Sounds like Patch.
These opening few chapters, though, are actually... That was a bit of a testy pop. These opening few chapters, though, are actually pretty good. That was another one. These opening few chapters are actually pretty good. Most of the combat takes place in close to medium range, so you can just gun down these enemies quite easily. Plus, the environments let you make good use of shoot dodging to deal with the influx of bad guys. It's just a fun, fast-paced opening, going from beating off dudes in a nightclub dance floor, that sounded wrong, to gunning more of them down in the streets with your trusty pooch partner. So what a fantastic idea it was at this point to completely stop doing that and then put you in prison for the next, hour. Yeah, you see at this point, after being blamed for the death of Augie, who was apparently a philanthropist in the public eye, Jack is then sent to horny jail. It's like Tango and Cash, just without Cash or Robert Zadar.
You don't look so tough now, do you? Do you fuck?
And what follows is honestly one of the worst sequences in the entire game, where you've got to spend all this time running around this prison, completing minigames to collect packs of cigarettes, in between getting into fistfights with all these other inmates. I hope you got the hang of the melee combat earlier, because if you didn't, well, by the end of this chapter, you're gonna have needed to. It's not all that hard to learn though, you're really just either punching or kicking, able to pull off some basic combos using alternate inputs, though I kind of found that mashing the punch button by itself seemed to work fine for me most of the time. But it's honestly just not a very good system. You really just kind of hold down the block button, wait for an enemy to finish their combo, and then punch them back. You're often so overwhelmed by enemies at once though that it just becomes a bit of a clusterfuck, and the camera can often be your greatest foe here as well.
Don't hurt me!
Talk about cliches too, man. I mean, at one point you're in a fist fight in the prison showers, fighting over who has to stop and bend over to pick up the soap. But it's these mini games that I think suck the most. And Dead to Rights just loves throwing these in to mix things up, like lock-picking, defusing bombs, and pole dancing. Well, don't mind the last one so much. This one in prison where you've got to time button inputs to hit a speed bag might be the worst thing ever designed by another human being. And watching the totally buff Jack Slate, citizen of the hardest place on earth, struggle to clean and jerk 135 pounds is one of the funniest things I've ever seen. How about this one later on? We need to arm wrestle another inmate to see who has to get their salad tossed. And wait a minute, that grunt kind of sounded familiar. Come to think of it, there was a sound I heard later in the game which almost sounded like Snake's death scream from Metal Gear Solid. You even get into a fist fight with a warden at one point for little more than just him kind of being a dick to your dog, who for some reason they keep locked up at the prison as well, which makes no sense.
Dead man walking.
Just like this line the warden says later on.
Hey, Slate, when you get to hell, mention my name, and they'll give you a discount.
I mean, that doesn't make any sense either, does it? Doesn't make any sense! Luckily though, at this point, you finally break out of the prison after the electric chair gets sabotaged by a preacher who takes a liking to Jack. Yeah, and I love too how they show 4 close-ups of this liquid hitting the machine. You know, like we wouldn't see it the first, second, or the third time. Then in the midst of all this ensuing chaos, Jack escapes through the sewers underneath the prison, showing off what might be the slowest ledge walking of all time. I mean, seriously dude, I think I can do this faster myself in real life. Thankfully after this though, Dead to Rights starts to find its stride again, putting you back in the middle of these rain-soaked streets as you gun down gang members with dual pistols, shotguns, and assault rifles. And anyone who knows me knows I love my rain-soaked streets, especially on the 6th generation consoles. And this stuff just absolutely nails it. It's kind of weird too because Dead to Rights really ain't a very good looking game though, even for its time. But whoever worked on these environmental effects really earned their paycheck, man, because this stuff looks great, and it just adds so much to the immersion and the world building. From this point on, I really started to notice that the game had stopped fucking around. And from this next cemetery level and on, you'll start to notice these random sections that just have these insane difficulty spikes. During the cemetery, for instance, the game frequently puts enemies off on ledges in the distance, and although you've never really had to use that manual aim mode before, at this point it becomes almost essential, because most of your guns aren't going to hit jack shit unless you're aiming at someone within arm's reach. Also, for this whole level, you're fighting guys dressed as clowns, and this whole chapter just absolutely kicked my ass.
Fuck this shit!
came in this fucking room and everything went fucking bad.
Especially considering that for most of what comes after this, I never really had this problem. I guess it makes sense though, considering this game is set in the hardest place on Earth.
Hardest place on Earth.
Either way though, let me tell ya, from this point on, it took a lot of willpower and single malt whiskey to keep me playing. And I could really understand now how some people might have been polarized by this Xbox version's increased difficulty. It also kind of feels like there's always some kind of new gimmick from chapter to chapter at this point.
What's going on?
Like for the chapter right after this, you're on the machine gun in a chopper, defending Eve a bunch of times by shooting enemies before they can finish her off. A mechanic which never comes back for the remainder of the game, ever. Even after you get through all of this too, she still dies in the most unceremonious fashion after catching a knife to the back from Patch. So yeah, all that work for nothing. Nothing.
Take it easy.
I kept thinking she was gonna come back later on in the game, maybe like as an antagonist after faking her death or something, but nah, that's it. She takes it in the back like Julius Caesar and then is never seen or heard from ever again. Next chapter, you're in a building and having to use Shadow to find all of these hidden bombs, and it's the same routine over and over, controlling this little dude as he sniffs the bombs out, then this really easy but time-wasting minigame where you've got to glide this ball bearing around the bomb's exterior to disarm it. Then the end of this chapter has like a whole sequence where you've got to rush from floor to floor to avoid dying from heat exposure, all while putting out fires with an extinguisher and fighting mercenaries who, I guess, have no sense of self-preservation. This also kind of marks the halfway point for the campaign as you're up to the 8th chapter out of 15.
You gotta be kidding me.
But what comes next is the absolute worst thing yet, and it makes the prison look like a goddamn holiday pit stop in comparison. So after clearing out an entire dockside full of workers, ending with a fight against a longshoreman, you can't make this shit up, Jack meets up again with his friend Hildy, who I'm only noticing now is sporting a goddamn tramp stamp. Go! And how did I not notice that before? I mean, it's not like I was distracted or anything. Oh, no, that's right, yeah. Anyway, old mate Diggs then shows up hot on his trail after being an extra in a Guy Ritchie film.
Oi, look at this, fellas.
And, I don't know, incapacitates Jack, I guess, by punching him in the dick really hard.
Major fracture detected.
To be fair though, getting hit in the dick does hurt quite a bit. When I was 12 years old, I caught a cricket ball with my testicles, and I still flinch in pain at the very thought of it. You then have to survive this short torture sequence where you've got to hold your breath by mashing the A and B buttons while being dunked in a tank of Gamer Girl bathwater, which kind of feels like something out of a Metal Gear Solid game.
Thanks, but in this country we usually just take showers.
Followed by more fist fighting against every single dock worker, I think, on the entire planet. I'm not kidding, man. The amount of guys you have to beat up in this level is just ridiculous. And the only way to progress through these areas is by beating everyone to a pulp. Luckily, you have got Shadow to help you get by here, but this is still such a long and arduous sequence. And at this point, this chapter's been going on longer than anything you've played prior. The previous chapters might take you anywhere from 20 to 30 minutes to beat, but this one creeped well into the 60+ minute mark. When the game finally gives you back your guns, the difficulty again takes a massive spike. And from this point on, I pretty much had to use every person I could as a human shield, or else enemies would turn my butthole into Swiss cheese in seconds. And I lost count of the amount of poor sods that I grabbed at gunpoint here before having to execute them like a stone cold killer. I mean, look at this shit, man. It's absolutely savage. This is again too where I saw a bit of the Die Hard influence sneaking back into the story, because at this point Jack is wearing nothing more than a white singlet, and the plot involves him figuring out that the bad guy's main plan is all about stealing gold bars without the city finding out. I mean, it kind of sounds familiar, doesn't it?
$140 billion.
This all leads him back to the prison again, but don't worry, because it's nowhere near as bad this time, because now you're actually able to use guns. I will say though that it is ball-bustingly hard, as in, your balls will bust. With things like enemies just camping on the other end of closed doors, ready to say hello to your face with a Spaz 12.
Surprise, motherfucker!
But no matter how crushing this level might be, and it is crushing, it all pales in comparison to what awaits us at the end of the chapter. The boss fight against Diggs himself.
Take it back, or I'll tear your bloody crust off.
Haha, like you could.
Now, I knew that I'd have to fight this guy since earlier on in the game when someone said that he was a retired boxer. As soon as I heard that, I was like, yep, I'm gonna have to punch this dude to death at one stage. And I wasn't wrong, but I still had no idea what I was in for. The fight itself is pretty simple to explain. It's just you and Diggs one-on-one in this mini arena, and after you dish out a bunch of damage, he runs off and floods the area with a toxic gas, keeping the only available gas mask for himself. At this point, you need to hit him to knock the mask off and grab it for yourself. Otherwise, it blurs your vision and drops your health. Of course, this doesn't apply to him though when he's not wearing the mask because, yeah, that's fair. And he's obviously going to try to knock the mask off your face as well. Now, this fight sounds fine in principle, but the problem is that Diggs just breaks the rules constantly. In fact, he doesn't even play by the rules to begin with. For instance, in the middle of one of your combos against him, he can just randomly start attacking, breaking through your combo and going off into one of his own. Because again, yeah, that's fair. There doesn't seem to be any timing or windows to attacking back either. Up to this point, the game's taught you that after blocking enemy attacks, you've got like a second or so to attack them back. So you'd think that after blocking one of Diggs' combos that he'd be vulnerable for like a second or so, but it doesn't seem to matter and it really just seems to be down to pure RNG. Sometimes he blocks and sometimes he doesn't. What's most annoying though is how it can often throw you after grabbing onto you, at which point you've got literally like a nanosecond to press that B button to break out of it. Now try doing all of this when your vision is all fucked up from inhaling toxic levels of methane. There was 1.2 where I thought I'd found an exploit. It seemed if I moved backwards for a bit and then came in, punching at just the right time, I could hit him with an uppercut that he was unable to block. But he quickly learned from that and put me right in my place. I gotta say, I spent close to probably 45 minutes on this fight. At one point, I started laughing hysterically like an actual crazy person surrounded by padded walls, because I just had no idea what I was supposed to do. I just stopped thinking that beating this guy was even possible.
Why isn't it possible? It's just not. Why not, you stupid bastard?
When I was finally able to beat him, even then it wasn't really out of skill, just because he kind of glitched out when he was trying to grab the mask and I was able to finish him off, with barely a bee's dick of my own health left. To me, it honestly feels like a boss out of an old arcade beat 'em up like Double Dragon or Streets of Rage, the kind of boss designed for two players to team up on at once. I almost kind of half expected to see an insert more coins message pop up when he beat me. I mean, that kind of makes sense given the pedigree of Namco as developers. I mean, these are the guys who created Pac-Man and Galaga, arcade classics that people like my parents still enjoy to this day.
Take it back.
It's just kind of weird how the bosses in this game are either really, really simple, being little more than just shooting them until they die,
See you in hell!
or crushingly tough and confusing to defeat like Diggs is. Like these two blonde bimbo twins you fight later in the game. I mean, one has a grenade launcher which kind of stings if it hits ya, like a bee's dick. But the strategy is really just run around, don't get hit much, and shoot them back.
Running out of time.
And then the boss after that, to prove my point, is the complete opposite. It's a big fat gangster looking dude in a suit called Pinnacle, who is in no way influenced by Kingpin from Marvel Comics. That was sarcasm, by the way. Now to prove my point again, you don't even fight this guy in the traditional sense. You just have to kind of circle around him from a distance, avoiding these wild haymakers and unavoidable homing attacks before he tires himself out. Then you jump on him from behind for a piggyback ride and choke him out. And after doing this like, shit, I don't know, a dozen times, he finally goes down for good, with Jack then snapping his neck like it's a goddamn twig.
Call us even.
Yeah, this guy right here, this is our hero, snapping the necks of people he's already subdued like a complete fucking psychopath. The next boss is also a pain in the ass. It's a drunk, shirtless guy who runs around spitting out fire in between shredding you with a goddamn machine gun. And when I say that, I actually mean spitting out fire, not dropping down fat rhymes or anything like that. Literal fire. Have I used that joke before? And don't even get me started on those enemies who spit fire at you. Not in like a hip-hop sense, I mean they actually spit fire.
Because I spit hot fire.
He's also somehow able to refill his health bar by swilling from a whiskey bottle unless you're able to shoot it out of his hands. And look, can someone please tell Namco that that's not how alcohol works? In fact, I think that's literally the opposite effect of what alcohol has on the body. Then you've got the final boss, which starts off pretty crappy, having to play Matador with this guy's electric riot shield, before the final confrontation in Freddy Krueger's boiler room, which kind of feels like the end fight from Commando, when Arnie beat the shit out of a skinny Australian man wearing chainmail.
What now, hotshot? Gonna give up like your old man?
But I do have to admit that this whole end fight is just badass. The guy's fists are on fire the entire time, and you end the fight by tossing him into a goddamn furnace. Not once, not twice, but thrice.
Fuck you!
Plus, I've never been so happy in my life to see the sight of a man burning to death before, because finally Dead to Rights was finished and I'd never have to play it again.
Can someone call an ambulance? I'm in quite a lot of pain.
You see, the thing is, Dead to Rights is definitely an entertaining game, no one can argue that, but it is also an incredibly antiquated one as well. Coming from that period where game developers thought it was fine to just make a game stupidly hard as a means to extend the longevity. And look, I get it, games were expensive back then. They didn't always have multiplayer modes or unlockables to keep people coming back, so making the game as challenging and crushing as possible, if it extended the time the player could spend with it, well, it was deemed to be a perfectly valid justification. Thankfully, in the years that have passed since, the industry has learned that that's a dumb idea. But games like Dead to Rights still serve as testaments to when the bullshit meter used to go well into the red. And even now, with all my years of experience as a pin-dicked game pro, this thing still left me battered and bruised. I definitely said a lot of naughty words when I was playing through this thing. The kind of naughty words that make it sound like I was doing an impersonation of Tourette's guy. But you know what? That's what Dead to Rights is all about. A game that lets you punch women of questionable moral fibre in the face, watch your pet dog rip out the throats of countless gang members, and get shot to death for the 50th time, to a man dressed in a clown costume shooting you from a window the size of a matchbox. And after all, that's what you'd expect for a game set in the hardest place on Earth.
Hardest place on Earth.
In other words, it's a masterpiece.
Bleeding there.